Rogan's devoted fans regularly tune in to consume episodes that often last longer than your average REM cycle. But lately, Rogan's come under fire for spreading misinformation about COVID, interviewing some pretty sus people, and supplying enough racial slurs for multiple compilation videos. In fact, it's starting to feel like the only person more fervent than a Joe Rogan fan is a Joe Rogan hater. So what makes Joe Rogan such a provocative cultural flashpoint? Why does this seemingly normal specimen of a man inspire equally aggressive amounts of love and anger? And ultimately, what does Rogan's prominence say about our society? Let's dig in and find out in this Wisecrack edition, what's the deal with Joe Rogan? Now, let's be clear. We've posed a question with no easy answer. Joe Rogan's deal is innately hard to define. That's in large part because there really isn't anyone else doing what he's doing, at least at his level of fame and influence. Sure, he asks people questions under the pretext of gathering information, but he doesn't claim to be a journalist. He talks to experts, but has never himself claimed to be an expert on anything, except maybe porn.
Oops. Yeah. I'm like, whew, I got it out of my system. Now I can concentrate on my life, my career, and if I meet somebody, I won't be so needy.
And he might perform stand-up, but on the show, he doesn't function as a comedian. He's unabashedly in search of genuine discourse about a range of topics. His listeners often say that they see themselves reflected in Rogan. He paints himself as an average dude who just so happens to be able to hold his own in conversation with everyone from comedians to astrophysicists.
So philosophy and quantum mechanics, they sort of, they share some sort of a border.
Importantly, Rogan has crafted a platform for himself that grants him complete control over his public image, and he seems to use it to intentionally baffle the mainstream media. Because Rogan rarely gives interviews, the only way to understand him is to actually listen to his lengthy podcasts. This gives him a heavily cultivated outsider status. That's even as he makes millions of dollars off one of the biggest media companies in the world, and arguably stands as one of the most influential people in America. But if Rogan
and is himself an oh, look at that, Kyle. And is himself an influential media company, okay? Joe Rogan as a singular individual is more impactful than many media companies that launch and inevitably fail, okay? Something to consider.
Rogan was just innocuously interviewing tons of people, he probably wouldn't be instigating this level of controversy. Though, of course, some of his guest choices have been questionable.
Oh, sweet baby Jesus, we are live, Gavin McInnes.
But where Rogan gets slipperier than a lubed up butter sculpture of a dolphin is in his actual beliefs. He has said, if you say you disagree with me, I probably disagree with me too. I disagree with me all the time. And indeed, his worldview is inherently impossible to define or pin down.
God damn it, I would wear that shirt, dude.
Opinions are not even internally consistent. Anytime someone levies a critique about his views as expressed in one episode, there seems to always be another episode where he says the opposite. It's a powerful tactic that does not work in other forms of media enterprise. Typically, ideological consistency is demanded. It'd be like if the New York Times editorial board refuted itself every week.
Wait, they kind of do that, though. Like, low-key. Actually, they don't. Wow. They're usually hyper-capitalist. But, like, there have been instances where the New York Times editorial board has... I can't tell if he's joking.
And because any one of his controversial opinions is personally...
Okay, he's not joking about it. Yeah, no, the editorial board does actually... I guess they don't... The editorial board doesn't, but, like, op-ed pieces routinely fucking... contradict itself.
Contradicted by him.
Please, Hasan, fight the urge to be a Rogan head. Wait, I am not a fucking Rogan head, dude. I mean, I like Joe Rogan, I do, but you know, there's not. But I think I'm pretty critical of Joe Rogan. Let's be real.
He can get away with voicing just about any viewpoint he wants. That means he can't really be held accountable the way other public figures actually striving for consistency.
Would you wear this guy's online ceramic shirt too? Absolutely.
Rogan might mock mask wearing with comedian Bill Burr.
I just love how wearing a mask became like this like soft thing that you were doing, like being courteous. Being courteous. Why is it for I thought it was so stupid.
But just a few months earlier, he hosted epidemiologist Michael Osterholm, who issued grave warnings about the importance of taking the virus seriously.
Well, first of all, you have to understand the timing of it in the sense that it's just beginning. And so in terms of what hurt, pain, suffering, death has happened so far is really just beginning.
And then, a year later, he gave a platform to cardiologist Peter McCullough, who claimed that the pandemic was planned by universities like Johns Hopkins.
And it seemed to be completely organized and intentional in order to create acceptance for and then promote mass vaccination.
Oh, consistency, where art thou? Anyway, by establishing himself as an open-minded goofball who just likes to chat with smart people, Rogan creates a unique intellectual liminal zone in which he and his audience can just ask questions, even if those questions are being posed to and by some controversial folks.
I don't think he said Bill Burr was anti-masker, because the video footage that they showed, I think he misunderstood that. Because the video that you just showed,
these nuts.
the video that they just showed was him being pro-mask, so.
Across the political spectrum, Rogan belies comparison. With conservatives like Ben Shapiro or Alex Jones, liberals like the Pod Save America guys, or leftists like streamer Hasan Piker, the agenda being relayed is always pretty explicit. In contrast, Rogan has cultivated a platform of
What's up, dude? What's up, dude? That's it? Is that the only mention I get? That's what it
loyal
was?
followers who intrinsically believe in and
Who's
trust
that guy,
him,
dude?
despite not fully knowing what his beliefs are. Perhaps the closest thing we have today to what Rogan does is something like The View, where a group of women sit around and chat about a broad range of topics they lack expertise on, but have strong feelings about. Like Rogan, they'll bring in experts to learn from, to lend credibility, and to hopefully offer the audience some intellectual value. But because there isn't really a The View for men, many fans see Rogan as providing a masculine-coded space that doesn't exist elsewhere. Furthermore, Rogan doesn't talk down to his audience, and that's a big deal, because a lot of Rogan fans see mainstream media as being pretty judgy towards non-mainstream opinions. But Rogan harbors no judgment towards his guests or his audience. Hell, he's got no judgment for anyone. Come as you are. In Rogan's universe, everybody with an opinion is cool, from Bernie Sanders to a Proud Boy. The only real sin is not listening to each other. And that's what makes Rogan so compelling. His listeners don't feel like they're being told what to think. They see Rogan fostering open dialogue across the ideological spectrum, and then having enough faith in his audience to draw their own conclusions. Taken at face value, that sounds great. If we buy the curated image that Rogan has crafted of himself and his podcast, it actually sounds pretty benign. Now, importantly, because of Rogan's intellectual flexibility and willingness to talk to anyone, many of his listeners describe him as an outside disruptor speaking truth to power and countering mainstream narratives. This characterization, though, ignores an important reality. These days, Joe Rogan is as mainstream as it gets. Indeed, each week his podcasts get more listeners than any single evening of programming on a major news network. Even as he pitches himself as an outsider, it's hard to not call him mainstream. This apparent contradiction was explained by the New York Times podcast, The Daily, which posits that there are really two mainstream medias at play here. There's what they call the corporate legacy mainstream, that is, huge newspapers like the New York Times or a television news network. These organizations are supposedly held to certain journalistic standards and practices, like fact-checking, source vetting, and not spreading misinformation. In practice, this doesn't always go perfectly, but the ideals still stand. Reporters, editors, legal teams, and fact checkers all collaborate to ensure their content is responsible and unimpeachable. They are machines with lots of moving parts and a lot of money. This is the establishment mainstream. And then there's Rogan's mainstream, a sort of Wild West where the rules of journalism no longer apply. While a skilled interviewer, Rogan's not beholden to those same standards of research, sourcing, fact-checking, and so on. His podcast is informal. It allows a wide range of viewpoints without concern for whether or not those views are properly backed up by standards like peer review. As a result, he's seen as being anti-establishment and allowing those not typically given a platform to speak. So, Rogan's not journalism, but he's also not explicitly trying to entertain in the usual sense of the word. Sure, he'll have funny comedians and actual conspiracy theorists on his show, but he'll also invite highbrow intellectuals. In a world where the line between entertainment and journalism has become increasingly blurry, Rogan collapses that dichotomy entirely. And while his fans may see themselves as pushing
Wait, isn't that the fucking North Korean person who like likened Columbia University to North Korean labor camps? Yeonmi Park, right? That's her name, I think. Man, Rogan has like, dude, Joe Rogan has the weirdest fucking guests on, dude. It's just like, it just straight up is not. There's a slant there, okay?
Back against the corporate legacy mainstream, they are very much a part of Rogan's mainstream, complete with a huge voice and a huge platform. This is no counterculture, but his mainstream is undoubtedly pushing back against gatekeeping. And the experts and intellectuals that modern journalism relies on are often considered to be doing just that. To understand Rogan's appeal as the self-defined common man of the media, we have to understand anti-intellectualism as a force in America. Now, there's been a long-standing tension in America between the so-called elite intelligentsia and the average Joe. While our earliest leaders were undoubtedly the headiest of intellectuals, men of the mind were met with suspicion as early as Thomas Jefferson's presidential run in 1796. And in the early 19th century, as the ideals of populist democracy came to the forefront of the American consciousness, the goal was to eliminate status differences in public life. According to historian Richard Hofstadter, the leagues of common men wanted to get along with as little leadership as possible from the educated and propertied class. In a country where most people didn't even have an elementary education, where could these common folks look for guidance, if not to learned scholars? Rather than, say, pushing to expand the realm of higher education to make it accessible to the everyman, something else happened. As Hofstadter explains, as popular democracy gained strength and confidence, it reinforced the widespread belief in the superiority of inborn, intuitive, folkish wisdom over the cultivated, over-sophisticated, and self-interested knowledge of the literati and the well-to-do. That is to say, the ethos of 19th century America was to trust your gut, not a book. We see touches of this mindset in some of Rogan's logic-driven but ultimately disreputable pontificating today. For example, Rogan once said something about COVID vaccines that might first strike you as relatively intuitive.
But if you're like 21 years old and you say to me, should I get vaccinated? I go, no. Yeah. Are you healthy? Are you a healthy person? Like, look, don't do anything stupid, but you should take care of yourself. You should, if you're a healthy person and you're exercising all the time and you're young and you're eating well, and like, I don't think you need to worry about this.
Of course, within the epidemiological community, there's near unanimous agreement that young, healthy people absolutely should be vaccinated, because the issue is more complicated than Rogan's common sense. That speaks to an inconvenient reality about our world. The Venn diagram of intuition and fact does not always overlap. Anyway, Rogan addressed the backlash by essentially abdicating intellectual responsibility. But back to history. Anti-intellectualism in America was really off to the races with the rise of Jacksonian democracy around 1822. Andrew Jackson's administration distrusted expertise and intellectual, and basically kickstarted their expulsion from political life for decades. Now, as author Tom Nichols points out in his book, The Death of Expertise, societies tend to thrive when people don't have to rely on their own expertise in every single arena of life. Back when everybody had to be able to hunt their own food, build their own homes, and make their own clothes and bind their own wounds, workmanship was a lot shoddier. Not having enough time to devote to knowing one thing or a small number of things made our ancestors jacks of all trades and masters of none. But for a lot of American history, this kind of self-reliance by the uneducated common man was extolled as virtuous. At the same time, because most professions back then required little to no formal education, intellectualism was seen more as a luxury than as a necessity. The growing world of business also emphasized intuition versus over-intellectualizing. Again, not unlike Joe Rogan. But as the world became increasingly complicated via the Industrial Revolution, it also became increasingly difficult to be functionally self-reliant. Experts with specific knowledge were brought back into the fold of political life in the Progressive Era at the end of the 19th century, where they would basically maintain sway throughout the New Deal era. Back then, their priorities pretty much aligned with those of the aggrieved common man, who had seen their country hijacked by the likes of Gilded Age robber barons. But what really changed everything, according to Hofstadter, was the rise of anti-communist sentiment in America. See, a fair amount of public intellectuals had communist sympathies, and due to anxieties that climaxed during the Red Scare of the 1950s, these experts in everything from social sciences to chemistry to screenwriting were systematically purged from public life. Across
One of the wildest parts about that retconning is like that Americans just simply don't think any of these like prominent, intelligent individuals, like prominent intellectuals, revolutionary thinkers, from MLK to even Einstein, for example, were just straight up fucking socialists. Like, and not only is that not known, but that fucking attitude, that Red Scare era anti-communist sentiment is so deeply ingrained in American thought that when you explain to people that no, they are actually socialists, like they wrote extensively on it, like Einstein, for example, like literally wrote about socialism and how it was fucking poggers. People will be like, no, that's not true. That's just not true, man. It's crazy. Like, that's how effective brainwashing is. That's how effective the Red Scare was. It's like hard to comprehend.
the board, intellectuals were met with a suspicion and hostility that, as Hofstadter noted in 1963, was still alive and well. But ironically, at the same time as hostility towards intellectuals was resurging, America began needing experts more than ever. As Hofstadter explained of early 1960s America...
What? You don't realize how you still have some as well? What?
Society has grown greatly in complexity and in involvement with the rest of the world. In most areas of life, formal training has become a prerequisite to success. At the same time, the complexity of modern life has steadily whittled away the functions the ordinary citizen can intelligently and comprehendingly perform for himself. This only intensified as America became increasingly oriented towards knowledge work. In the complicated post-industrial revolution world, we can't all know everything. So, we rely on experts, an architect to design the building, an electrician to wire it, a plumber to make the toilet work, etc. In situations like this, we understand that someone who has been trained and certified and worked at it for years is probably the person you want. Even if, like me, you thought you could fix your toilet and then ended up having to number 2 at a coffee shop for a week. But as Nichols notes, this isn't the case when it comes to more heady, less hands-on work. Americans, he writes, tend to really chafe at the idea that we're not all equally as smart and capable as the next guy, especially if we still suspect that guy might have communist sympathies.
American exceptionalism is what that attitude comes from. Like, Americans are incredibly entitled. Americans are incredibly fucking up their own asses and think that they think that they just like straight up have an opinion that has to be heard by people.
So even as American resentment towards intellectuals grew, we became increasingly reliant on them in every facet of life, thus further augmenting that resentment. Nichols argues that this hostility has continued into the present day, and we think that's part of why Rogan is so appealing. He's not an expert, and doesn't try to be. He embodies an overarching ethos that, as Hofstadter puts it, the plain sense of the common man is an altogether adequate substitute for, if not actually much superior to, formal knowledge and expertise. And this is an ethos that has dominated American society for much of its history. Now, there's a real psychological reason why trusting experts can feel disempowering, especially as we've entered the knowledge era. where hugely complex endeavors like sequencing the human genome or coding self-driving cars have been accomplished. It's easy to feel like we know nothing, and that's not a fun feeling. As Nichols writes, the fact of the matter is that we cannot function without admitting the limits of our knowledge and trusting in the expertise of others. We sometimes resist this conclusion because it undermines our sense of independence and autonomy. This natural human reaction among individuals is dangerous when it becomes a shared characteristic among entire societies. In other words, it's fair to hate being wrong about stuff. The problem is when this becomes a larger societal mindset. Because what happens if nobody's willing to be wrong, if every opinion holds equal weight, regardless of its grounding in facts or reality? When this becomes a society's guiding ethos, we run the risk of dismantling the very foundations of knowledge that enable progress. As Nichols notes, today, the issue is not indifference to established knowledge. It's the emergence of a positive hostility to such knowledge. It is a new declaration of independence. No longer do we hold these truths to be self-evident. We hold all truths to be self-evident, even the ones that aren't true. And that's where we
Did you watch the North Korea propaganda video that came out today? Did I? That's how I started off my day, dude.
Into trouble with Joe Rogan. Sure, the guy consults plenty of reputable experts, but he also consults people who have been ostracized by the scientific community for spreading misinformation and extolling science that hasn't been replicated or peer-reviewed. He also regularly...
Yeah, I don't like how much Tom Nichols is... I don't like how much he fucking had Tom Nichols prominently featured in this video.
Asks people their opinion on topics on which they are not experts and probably haven't formed opinions with the same rigor as someone with, say, a graduate degree. So what happens when this potpourri of voices is heard on the same platform? The message becomes implicit. All of these truths are equally valid. When you have folks urging people to get vaccines and some urging you not to, the collapse of reliable truths becomes truly dangerous. Sure, you might choose to take the expert certified opinion that vaccines save lives to heart. Or you might vibe more with Rogan's implicit logic that vaccines are an unnecessary risk for young people. Or you may favor the doctor whose unprovable anti-vax views leave him standing alone in the medical community. But when all opinions are given equal weight, choosing who to believe becomes a trickier prospect. And this is actually made all the more complicated by Rogan's personal affect. He has an almost childlike sense of credulity, often acting as impressed, surprised, or delighted by someone's opinion. And sure, Rogan might push back on some of his most inflammatory guests.
The doctor responsible for inventing mRNA vaccines, dude, look how fucking widespread misinformation is. He's not responsible for inventing mRNA vaccines, dude. Okay? It's just not even remotely true. And he himself, Robert Malone, has personally admitted that it's not true when questioned about it. So he wrote one fucking paper in like 1985, I think, or 1989. I don't know exactly what year it was, about the delivery mechanism of the mRNA vaccine. There are people that are profoundly more important in its development.
Though he does give them plenty of time to share their opinion. But overall, he's more interested in hearing his guests out than in engaging in rigorous debate, and this is the root of the problem. To explain, we need to look to epistemology, a branch of philosophy concerned with investigating knowledge and human understanding, or how we know what we know, and specifically the subsection of that branch called virtue epistemology. Virtue epistemologists spend a lot of time thinking about epistemological virtues, i.e. intellectual virtues, or
Dr.
qualities
Post
of a
Malone
person's
invented
character or disposition that contribute to their ability to acquire knowledge. These include traits like curiosity, humility, objectivity, and creativity. Epistemological vices, as scholar Eric Kramer explains, are the opposite. Character traits or thought patterns that impede or prevent the acquisition of knowledge. These include dogmatism, intellectual...
Not true. Rogan does press his viewers. Maybe not always, but what that guy said isn't really correct either. Yes, as the fucking #1 Joe Rogan head in the media, I say this all the time. Joe Rogan has certain issues that he will not budge on, okay? Like the top of the hour ad break coming at 5:15 rather than at 5 p.m. He will not budge on it, okay? He's going to serve it no matter how much you write in the chat, like, oh, run the ad, run the ad, run the ad. Like, he will not budge on it. Thank you, Chad Rage, for the 5 gifted subs, allowing 5 people to no longer see the ads. If you don't want to see those ads, okay, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do that for $5. If you're not lucky enough to get gifted a sub, okay, you can do that for free with a Twitch Prime if you don't have $5. This is the 1 minute ad break now. But Joe Rogan does have issues that he will literally press people on. It's just that, unfortunately, vaccine misinfo has become one of those issues. Okay? You get it? Do you understand? That's the problem. Things would be better if it was just smoking weed or whatever. The issues that he has like a hardline stance on that is that will not budge. If those issues just stayed in the field of smoking weed, then that would be fine. But now it's like trans athletes. That's one that he will never bend on. And then the other is like vaccine misinfo. It's one that he will never bend on. Okay? Sucks.
Dishonesty and wishful thinking. The most important epistemological vice for our purposes is gullibility or credulity. Though the term epistemological vice is somewhat new, the concept goes way back. In 1661, philosopher Joseph Glanville criticized skepticism and credulity as equal and opposite vices toward the obtaining of knowledge. Of credulity, he described the human tendency to make precipitate, i.e., hasty judgments when we choose to receive all things via promiscuous admission, which coincidentally was written about me in a bathroom stall in college. Basically, while the skeptic might choose not to accept even the most persuasive, well-formed argument, the credulous person does the opposite. Credulity implies a lack of discernment, and credulous folks tend to accept knowledge from the latest person they speak to, in spite of qualification or persuasiveness. It's being promiscuous with your brain, which, to be clear, is different than having an emotional affair. Credulity, like other epistemological vices, thus impedes the careful acquisition of knowledge. And that's what we think Joe Rogan's show is probably doing. By presenting a broad range of voices of varying degrees of credibility without rigorous pushback or a journalistic reliance on fact, the show establishes those views as essentially equally valid. And we'd argue that Rogan's much-lauded open-mindedness falls more in the camp of credulity. What's more, the way he exhibits this trait with nearly every guest encourages the audience to similarly lack discernment. In a way, Joe Rogan's success in America makes a ton of sense. He's kind of the contemporary embodiment of that old American populist tendency to trust your gut when you hear something that sounds right, rather than listening to the annoying expert who's been studying the topic for years. These days, it's become something of a cliche to say that podcasting comedians like Rogan are the new philosophers. But in Rogan's case, epistemic credulity is precisely what makes him not at all like, say, Socrates, the first live-action podcaster. Socrates built his philosophical wisdom on self-examination and the acceptance of one's own ignorance, which meant that when he had guests, i.e. Athenian leaders, on his podcast, i.e. a street corner, he aimed to push them through a series of questions to evaluate the truth of their arguments. Unlike Socrates, Rogan...
Oh, so Rogan is just stupid? Just smear people some more, huh? Dude, Rogan himself admits he's fucking stupid, okay? And also, people are stupid. It's part of Rogan's appeal is that he's stupid. And other stupid people like him because they're also stupid. Same part of my appeal as well. I'm stupid. Okay?
Seems mostly comfortable with letting everyone share their opinions, with some exceptions, rather than pushing his guest and himself towards a deeper level of self-examination. So, if you're seeking philosophical wisdom, probably stick to YouTube. But what do you guys think? Is Joe Rogan's show a beacon of inquiry and wisdom, or is it a bastion of stoner anti-intellectualism? Let us know in the comments. Big thanks to our patrons, and be sure to check out our Patreon page if you have not before, because we are about to unveil some very cool new features. Pump up that subscribe button like your Rogan's beef-fueled biceps, and don't forget...
Okay. Well...
Thanks for helping me out with the hog brain.
I mean, there's like multiple different reasons as to why Joe Rogan is so popular, and part of it is because there's a complete breakdown in trust in mainstream media. There's a breakdown in the trust in government. They just don't trust their government for understandable reasons. They recognize some of the hurt that they feel. So it's quite difficult to trust the government after all of that. What's your biggest conspiracy theory about historical figures that you think probably didn't exist? I mean, I have a lot of conspiracy theories, but I don't know what you mean by conspiracy theories that probably don't exist. I can't speak on that. But I mean, I literally just mentioned that, like, my conspiracy theory, for example, is that Alex Jones is a psyop.
Hasan, I have turned into a Wisecrack viewer thanks to you, Wisecrack.